Welcome back, everybody. So in this video, I'm going to be showing you how I dye solid colors. Sometimes the yarn doesn't come out super solid, but that's the beauty of hand-dyed yarn. When you knit that up and you see these little slight variations in the color from like parts of the yarn are maybe slightly darker or lighter, it just brings life and adds character to the project that you're doing. So that's the beauty of hand-dyed yarn. If you don't like that, then you can go to the store and buy commercially dyed yarn. But if you love hand-dyed yarn like I do, you are going to embrace those little imperfections. But we can do a pretty good job. There's different techniques that you can use to really get the yarn as solid as possible. But I keep it very simple because I don't mind when the yarn has those little subtle variations. But they do, when you look at it, it will read pretty solid. So let me just show you some examples of what I'm talking about. All right, so these are some solid colors. And as you can see, they look solid. Now when you look at this color here, you can kind of see a little bit of what I was talking about, where when you look at it, the color does read as a solid or just one tone throughout. But if you look closely at it, you'll see that there's little tiny subtle variations in the color. All right, so the technique that I use is very simple, and I'm just going to get right into showing you how I dye solid colors. Now, one thing to keep in mind as well is that heat combined with acid is what is going to stick the color to protein fibers. So you can go back to my previous videos where I explain what protein fibers are. I have a video that talks about heat, and I have a video that talks about acid. So I am dyeing protein fibers. So that is what this video, the techniques I'm using are going to work with protein fibers. So keep that in mind, and you need to use acid dyes to do these techniques. So my yarn has been heating in an oven, so you want to make sure that your fibers are hot. So I just have them in water. And I have enough water in the pan to make sure that the yarn can move freely in it. Because the idea with this is we want the dye to totally surround and evenly coat the fibers, because we're going for that solid color. I'm going to be using liquid dye, and if you watch my video on how I mix dye, you can see how I got the liquid form here. So I just use powdered dyes, and then I mix them with water to get it in liquid form. So this is what I use when I'm dyeing solid colors. I always like to give my dyes a shake just to make sure that the powder is fully dissolved, because when it sits for a while it will kind of settle at the bottom. So just give it a good shake, to make sure that the dye is evenly distributed through the water and that we won't get a grainy texture to our finished project. So you might be wondering how much dye to apply to the yarn. So I'm using a merino yarn. It's a worsted weight, but each skein of yarn, I've got 5 skeins of yarn in each one of these pans. And the weight of each skein is 115 grams. So I use a very, very simple formula to know how much dye is going to be needed to coat the yarn evenly and give it a nice, good, solid saturation of color. So if each skein is 115 grams and I have 5 skeins of yarn in here, we're going to multiply 115 by 5. So when I do that, I get 575. So I'm just going to round that up to 600. 600 is easier to measure out than 575. And that means I'm going to apply 600 mils of dye to this yarn. So again, very simple. So again, I multiply the weight of the yarn by how many skeins of yarn I have in there. So 115 grams is what each skein is. I have 5 skeins in the pan, so I'm going to multiply 115 grams by 5, and that gave me 575. I bumped that up, I rounded that up to 600, so that means I'm going to apply 600 mils of dye to this pan. Now, because I really want a rich, deep saturation of color, what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply that 600 mils of dye to my yarn, to both pans, because they're both going to be the same color. So they're each going to get 600 mils. I haven't, now this is very important, I haven't added any acid to these pans. If I added acid, if acid was already in here, then the dye would immediately start to absorb into the yarn. I don't want that to happen because the dye would strike too quickly and it wouldn't evenly coat the yarn. So I talk a little bit more about this in, I think, my acid video, so you can take a look at that. But the idea is I want a really even coat of color. So I'm going to leave the acid out right now and add the acid at a later point. So the acid, or the 600 mils of dye, I'm going to apply to each one of these. And I'm going to do it twice because I really want this yarn to be really rich and I want that solid color to be really strong. So I'm going to apply 600 mils. I'm going to let that sit a bit, and then I'm going to apply a second application of 600 mils of yarn for a total of 1200. So there's going to be a lot of dye that's going into each of these pans, but I really want a really nice, deep, rich color. So like I mentioned earlier, I'm now adding the dye to the pan, and I like to add it into the water. So I've just lifted the skeins of yarn out. I'm making sure that the dye is totally dissolved in the water, because what we're going for is a nice, even, solid coat of color. So we want to make sure that there's no lumps of undissolved dye powder in here, because that's going to give us a patchy and not so pretty look to our final product. So we just want to make sure that if we do all the steps correctly, we'll be happy with the result. So again, there is no acid in this pan. It's just simply water and dye. So at this point, the dye is not going to adhere. It's not going to be totally absorbed into the fiber, because it does need that acid to do that. So if I pull it out, you can see there still is lots of dye in the water here. It's very insipid looking. The yarn hasn't really absorbed a lot. It's just stained it. And that's okay, because this is what we're doing, is just trying to encourage the dye to kind of give like a base coat. So it's staining the fibers, and so that when we do add the acid, it'll look more even. So let me just do that to the second pan here. Now when I dye solid colors, usually I'm going to use one color to do that. But in this case, the shade I'm going for, I'm going to use two similar colors. So obviously this is a red, so I'm using two shades of red to do this color. So this first initial coat, you'll see the red that I'm using. And then you'll see that I'm going to use, for the second application of color, it's going to be a red that's a little bit different, but it still is going to come out. It's going to come out as a solid color, but it's going to give me the shade that I want. So you see before, when I mentioned about I showed putting the water into the pan. I wanted to make sure there was enough water so that I can move the yarn around so that the dye can coat all around the strand of yarn. So that's important when you're dyeing solid colors. You want the yarn to be able to move freely so that you can really make sure that the dye is coating everywhere evenly. So I'm just going to flip the yarn. And you can see it's staining it. But if I were to take this yarn out and wash it, the dye would just run out of it, because I haven't used any acid to set that dye yet. But it is staining it, giving it a nice coating, kind of a nice base coat for me to layer more color on. I'm just pressing down on the yarn just to work the dye into the fibers. I'm not agitating it, I'm just pressing it down just to make sure that and then I just push the fibers to the side and just kind of wiggle them just to make sure that the dye can get all the way around the fibers. So now I'm ready to add the acid. So you can refer back to my video on acid. Because I want this color to be solid, I don't want to add too much acid. Other techniques I do, I really have a low amount of water and a really high concentration of acid because I want the dye to strike very fast and set. So if I'm doing techniques where I'm using the dry dye powder and I'm sprinkling the powder on because I want these little speckles, I really want that dye to strike and hit the yarn quickly and stay in place. That's not what I want to happen here. I don't want the color to set quickly because that would just produce a patchy, uneven look. So I want the dye to absorb into the fiber slowly so that it evenly coats each strand because I'm going for a solid color. So I have a good amount of water in here so that the dye can flow around it, and I'm going to use just a small amount of dye. So for this amount, I mentioned I've got about 5 skeins of yarn, so that's about a pound or so, a little over a pound of yarn in here. I'm only going to use about a cup of acid mix. So you can refer back to my video on how I make my own acid mix, but you could use vinegar. You could use the same amount of vinegar to get the effect, but I'm using citric acid that I mix myself. So I'm just going to apply a cup of that to each pan. The thing with dyeing yarn is it's a lot of trial and error and experimentation, and so I figured out and found out what works for me by experimenting. So you're going to do the same. I'm giving you guidelines, but there's no hard and fast rules. But this is what works for me and gives me the results that I'm happy with. So you can just use that as a guideline and then figure out what works best for you. So immediately, now that I've added the acid and the yarn is in hot water, so those two things, it's going to start reacting. So you can see that that water is already fading. The dye is coming out of it and it's being absorbed into the fiber. So it won't take long to finish that. But this color still isn't where I want it. It's starting to absorb that dye, but I like my colors to be really rich and saturated. So some might be happy with that, but I'm not. So I'm going to add another layer of color. So it's going to be the same amount as before. Remember, we're doing 600 mils of dye, but I'm going to use a slightly deeper red. This is kind of an orangey red. I'm going to layer on top of this a more true red, maybe a red that has a bit of blue in it. It's going to be a different shade of red anyway, just like this is. And the acid that I've dyed, that's going to be enough to set this yarn, so I don't need to add any more acid. So I'm going for the same amount. I'm going to do 600 mils of this other red color. And that's going to go into each pan. So again, I don't like to pour the dye directly onto the yarn, especially not now, because the acid is in here. So if I if I apply the yarn directly to the yarn, I'm going to have like these, what I call kind of hot spots, where there's going to be some really deep areas where the dye is striking quickly, and then lighter areas, and it's going to look stripy. It's not going to look nice and solid, and it's not going to be good. So I'm going to lift the yarn out and pour the dye into the water. Just mix it to make sure it's evenly in there. So you can see this color's a little bit, it's a little bit different. So you can see already that yarn has taken up the dye. That's the first red we put on. And then you'll see how it takes on a richer tone with this slightly different shade of red. And I'm just moving it around the same way as before, making sure that the dye coats all the fibers. And ever so often I'll just lift the yarn out and just make sure that it is being coated evenly, and that there isn't any white patches or any undyed bits or areas that look patchy. And then I'm just going to flip the yarn and make sure that the other side is coated too, so you can see how that looks so much richer already. There still is quite a bit of dye in the water, but once the acid has finished doing its work, that water will be clear, and it will all the color will be absorbed into the fiber. That's what I love about dyeing protein fibers. The acid that you use combined with the acid dyes, you don't have any dye left in the water. So you can, once this has done its work, you'll just have water, clear water left over that you can just feel good about pouring down the drain. All right, so I'm going to do the same thing with the other pan. 600 mils of our dye. And we're going to make sure not to pour it directly onto the yarn. You can see this water is getting quite clear, so the fiber has almost taken up all of that first color that we put in. So dyeing solid colors, it's very straightforward, it's very easy, but it just takes a little bit of care because what you're going for, again, is a solid color. So you want to make sure that the dye applies as evenly as possible. So I'm taking my time to move the yarn around gently to make sure that that happens. I'm flipping the yarn as well to ensure that I get as even a coat as possible. And that color is looking really beautiful. This is what I'm going for. A nice, rich, saturated color. Okay, so there still is a fair amount of dye in here. So as far as the dyeing process, or as far as what I need to do, I'm finished. So now the acid and the heat is going to continue to do the work and absorb the rest of that dye that's in here. So I'm just going to place it back into the oven, and I'm going to let it slowly do its thing. And once the water is clear, then I'm going to know that all of that dye has been absorbed.
I have more tips and information to share with you on the subject of dyeing solid colors. So I didn't want this video to be too long because there is a lot of information. So stay tuned for the next video, and I'm going to be showing you how to dye a solid color using just one color. But not only that, you're going to see how you can use one color of dye and vary the amount to get a different shade of that color. Also, I look forward to showing you all of the solid colors that I dyed. You'll be able to see the finished result. So I hope that you enjoyed this video and that you enjoy the next one. If you like this content and would like to see more of the same, then please subscribe to my channel if you wish. Leave a comment. I love reading your comments, and it really encourages me to make more videos and to also know what you would like to see in my videos. As well, share, like, all of that really does help my channel to grow. So again, I wanted to show my appreciation to all of you who watch my videos. Again, I love your comments, and until next time, bye.